As we continue our look at Acts chapter 2 and the church, we now focus on the fellowship. They devoted themselves to the fellowship. The word fellowship in the Bible is the word koinonia, and it means what it says on the tin, fellowship. So there's nothing that we can really draw out beyond what we can read with our own eyes in our own Bibles. Fellowship means fellowship. Fellowship is important. Think of a bonfire and all the pieces of wood or coal that are burning away whilst in the fire. One of them drops and falls away from the bonfire. When it falls, it remains hot and burning for a short time, but then eventually it goes cold because it's away from the rest of the fire. And in the same way, we need the body of Christ. We need the fellowship that the body of Christ brings, the fellowship that the church offers to each and every one of us as Christians, so that we can continue to burn bright for the Lord. Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. It tells us in Ephesians chapter 5 verse 25. Jesus didn't die for the church so that we can do our own thing. Through fellowship, there are 3 points that I want to bring out in this short message. Through fellowship, first of all, we get to know each other. I'm sure we could go across our churches and make statements about people. We could state facts concerning individual people. How can we do that? Because we know folks, because we've talked to them, because we've been in fellowship with them. And as we're in fellowship with people, we get to know them. The cross is horizontal as well as vertical. Yes, Jesus died first and foremost to make the way possible for man to reach out to God, for God to reach down to man through that vertical cross. But the cross is also horizontal. Jesus died not only to bring us to God, but also to establish the church, to bring us to each other. Don't keep our distance. Don't isolate ourselves from the body of Christ, but instead embrace it wholeheartedly, because that's God's plan for each and every one of us. They were devoted to fellowship, it tells us in Acts chapter 2, verse 42, which means they were devoted to each other. Fellowship is a great strength in attracting people. I'm sure we've all heard stories of folks that have been to church and no one spoke to them. It happened to my wife and myself once. We were on holiday and went to church. We arrived early, no one spoke to us. We went through the service, sat around at the end, no one came to us. And we left that church building with no one coming to us while we sat there in our seats. They talked amongst themselves and there was a buzz to the place and people were excited to see one another, but we sat there alone. Fellowship is a wonderful tool in reaching out to people around us. Even those that come into the church can experience the joys of fellowship. So through fellowship we get to know each other. Secondly, through fellowship we get to know ourselves. We can live in our own little world, cut ourselves off. Maybe we've been hurt. Maybe we're afraid of rejection. And so consequently, we build a wall around our lives. Or we put ourselves on an island with water between us and everyone else. But ultimately, we're the ones that suffer. We're the ones that lose out. Through interaction with other people, ultimately, we find ourselves. Other people become mirrors. And the faults that we see in others are very often the faults that we see in ourselves. And if all we do every time we come into conflict is say, Lord, change that person, change this person, then very often we miss the point. Because it's through those conflicts that we can look at ourselves. And yes, it may be the other person, but it might also be us as well. But it's only through relationship, it's only through the issues of conflict sometimes that we can truly find ourselves. Not always through conflict, through good fellowship, through good relationship, we can also find ourselves. And so we get to know ourselves through fellowship. And then thirdly, we get to know God through fellowship. The Bible tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20, we are Christ's ambassadors. An ambassador represents his country. An ambassador represents his government in a far-off land. People may not meet the government. They may not meet the people of that nation, but they meet the ambassador. And we've all been there where we've met a single person from another country, perhaps the only one that we've ever met from that nation. And maybe that person was good. We liked them. And so we make the statement, Canadians are nice people. French are nice people. Germans are nice people. Why do we say that? Because we met one person that was nice. And so consequently, we make a statement that covers the whole of that nation. In the same way, we can meet a bad German or a bad Canadian or whatever, and we can then make the negative statement. And that's why it's important for every Christian to be a light, to shine for Jesus Christ. Because the people that we come into contact with, we may be the only Christians that they really meet in their lifetime. And so it's important that we are living epistles, that the pages of the Bible come alive through our lives as we meet and connect with those around us in fellowship, in communication. As we interact with people, people will get to know God. Colossians 1:27 talks about Christ in you, the hope of glory. As we communicate with people, as we fellowship with people, then through us, hopefully, Christ comes through. So fellowship is important. It's not just an add-on that we can perhaps consider in our Christian lives. Those early believers in Acts chapter 2, it tells us they devoted themselves to the fellowship. And through fellowship, we get to know each other, we get to know ourselves, and thirdly, we get to know God.